I mean, I will today. I'll wish him all the best, him and his family, for the future. But I'm glad he's gone, because we need to remember the reasons why he had to leave office. You had the first Prime Minister in history that broke the law, one that's lied to Parliament, one that illegally shut down Parliament. So I'm glad that's over, and I hope that Liz Truss learns some of the lessons from that, because the language that you talked about, saying that the First Minister of Scotland was an attention seeker, we need to have a relationship where the government in London and the devolved administrations, when it's appropriate, can work together. We face what is the biggest economic crisis that we've had since the 1970s, and we have a responsibility to make sure that we can reassure the public and reassure businesses that we'll deal with the cost of living crisis. That's the priority that we have today. We need to make sure that we can cap energy prices, but there's going to be a big debate as to how this is paid. It can't be done on the way of just deferring bills for people. We need to make sure that government accepts its responsibilities. We're in the situation we're in no short measure because of the Ukraine war, and of course we stand with Ukraine in the illegal war that Putin is engaging on against them. But there's a price to be paid for that, and government needs to recognise that we need to have a windfall tax that fairly taxes those that have benefited from this, and we need to make sure that government puts its hand in its own pocket and pays for the costs. And crucially, if we do this, we can probably knock about 4 percentage points off inflation. So let's make sure that we do the right thing. Let's support consumers, let's support businesses, but now is not the time for having a debate about tax cuts. That would be the wrong thing to do, and I'm looking forward to having that engagement, that debate with the Prime Minister over the course of the next day or two.
Well, that's engagement and debate. That's a very magnanimous way to put it. Are you expecting there to be a little bit of a reset then after what was said during the leadership campaign?
But there has to be, because I think there's got to be a recognition that the government in Edinburgh has got its job to do, and we need to have appropriate communication with all the devolved administration, indeed with the opposition parties as well. We will have very clear political differences, but there are times that we need to make sure that when things are happening in Westminster like this, that's going to affect the devolved administrations, affect their budgets no less, that there's appropriate communication that's taking place. But secondly, I think there's got to be respect for the devolved administrations, and if you take the position that we are in, that we stood on a commitment of delivering an independence referendum in the first half of this Parliament, the first half of the Scottish Parliament, and Liz Truss has got to respect democracy and has got to respect the right of the Scottish Parliament to allow people in Scotland to have a say on their constitutional future.
Now, of course, there are reports this morning that Liz Truss is planning some kind of change to legislation to make it more difficult for an independence referendum to be held. Of course, there is going to be a hearing at the High Court all about the legality of a next independence referendum. Where do you stand on what you're hearing, these reports about Liz Truss and her potential plans?
Well, let me say it's barking mad. It's, I think, what we refer to as gerrymandering. When you stand for an election and when you have a referendum, you put your case, you encourage the electorate to vote, and of course you want to have the highest turnout possible. But the idea that somehow or other that you can change the rules, I think people in Scotland, whether or not they agree with us or not, are going to reflect on what is, a style of behaviour which is just completely unacceptable. And if you think about the rules that Liz Truss and our government are thinking of putting in place, that means, for example, that Brexit wouldn't have happened because you weren't able to clear that hurdle. You'd be left in a situation where those on the electoral roll that sadly may have passed on would effectively be counted as a no voter in such a contest. It's not right, it's wrong, and this should be put to bed. We should simply not be tolerating or considering these things. What we need to recognise is the Scottish Parliament has a mandate to deliver a referendum. My message to Liz Truss is she needs now to sit down with the First Minister of Scotland and negotiate the terms of that referendum to make sure it can take place in the timeline that the Scottish Government has indicated, which is a referendum in October 2023. I regret that we're having to go to the Supreme Court, but we're having to go to the Supreme Court because the government in London won't recognise that people in Scotland have that right to determine their own future.
Yeah, and the courts will make that ruling in due course, won't they? But, I mean, I'll pick you up on this, Mr Blackford. We've gone from this sort of reset, where you hope that the relationship is going to be better, to describing the plan as barking mad. And there's a bit of friction there, isn't there? And there is a coming to a head pretty soon between you guys and the incoming Prime Minister.
Well, it's about democracy and it's about fair play. And the idea that you can gerrymander the rules for a referendum is simply not right. And I think people, not just in Scotland, but right across the United Kingdom will recognise that. And I think there has to be a degree of common sense and rationality when we're having these discussions.
Now, Mr Blackford, of course, Liz Truss says that she wants to keep the union together, and that is her stated position. So, I mean, how do you expect this to play out?
I respect anybody that wants to argue the case for the Union, and they should do that. And that's a much more rational debate. Whether it's Liz Truss or the Scottish Conservatives or Scottish Labour, let them lay out their case as to how they see Scotland in the Union. And I want to have that debate because I want to be able to showcase what we can deliver with independence. I want to make sure that we can accelerate our green energy production, and I do that for the purpose of making sure that we can generate the investment that's required to deliver a green industrial future for Scotland. And of course, we need to deal with the problems for Brexit, and we're paying a price for that. And for us, the clear demonstration of the will of the people of Scotland is to be back in the European Union. So I look forward to having that debate. Let's have that respectful debate of what is in the best interest of the people of Scotland. But let's not have this silly debate about changing the electoral rules. Let's treat people with respect. Actually, let's have that debate about how we improve the lives of people that live in the country of Scotland.